Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in again. Guys, no matter where you're at in the country right now, you've probably got some good crayfish activity starting to take place. We're just going to be getting to it up here in the North Country. If you're in the middle part of the country, you definitely are right around the time period where crayfish are active again. And if you're down south, they've been active for a while. But today I want to go over a few things about the crayfish as to why they're important, and a few things you may not know about the crayfish, as well as some baits that you can use to mimic them to really take advantage of the fact that crayfish are coming out of so-called hibernation, and therefore you can increase the number of fish that you're catching by using these baits. Before I get into it, I do want to remind you that if you're looking to purchase some tackle, specifically that may mimic crayfish, then please use the Tackle Warehouse affiliate code that I've got in the description for the video. It's a great way to help the channel out, and at the same time, if you want to bookmark the link for future purchases, that's a great thing to do as well. I appreciate all the support that I get from you guys. And you can get, I think, all of these baits at Tackle Warehouse. I haven't taken a look, but they seem to carry pretty much everything. Okay, guys, so let's talk about crayfish. Crayfish are a valuable part to all of the different bass species. It is one of the main forages that they eat throughout the year. The thing is, when water temperature gets down into that low 50-degree range, crayfish get very, very inactive. They become dormant for the most part, or they go into what some would refer to as a hibernation stage. When that happens, usually what they'll do is burrow up into different pieces of cover. So, in some cases, it may be a hole in a mud bank. On riverbanks, you see this quite a bit, where they burrow into the shoreline, and they leave these holes in the bank, and they go into there and they kind of spend most of the winter in a dormant state. They may be somewhat active. They're not necessarily in a true hibernation, but they're very, very inactive. The same can be said for some dead pieces of wood and stuff that are on the ground. They will literally burrow up inside of pieces of wood or lay down trees. I have caught during the winter months, I've actually pulled up pieces of wood from the bottom of the lake that were hollowed out in the center and literally had 15 crayfish that were just in a dormant state right down the center of that log. They become very, very inactive, and because of that, the fish don't really eat them that much because they're not available to them. They can't actually get to the crayfish because they're burrowed up under a rock or in a tree or in a mud bank. So the fish kind of move away from them. But in the spring period, when you get back around that 50-degree water range, the crayfish start becoming active again. And when that happens, the fish really start to zone in on them, and they key in on them from a forage standpoint. It's kind of like what I would do if you took pizza away from me for 4 months. I probably would start eating pizza immediately once it became available again, because I love pizza, and crayfish really make up a very large part of the bass diet. So when you get into that 50-degree range, the crayfish start coming out and the bass start keying in on it. It's one reason why I think a lot of people say red works in the spring. I'm not necessarily sold on that because crayfish are all different colors. You can have greens, browns, blues, reds, oranges, mixtures of it all. So I'm not necessarily sold on the red, but I do think it makes some sense. A couple other things to point out with crayfish is they kind of throughout the year, as they grow, they need to shed their exoskeletons. And they do that, my understanding is they do it like once a month when they're young. And then once they hit like a mature stage, I think it's like 3 or 4 times a year. So it's spread out. But when that happens, they literally shed their skin. And at that point, a lot of times they will also go into a little bit more of a dormant state because they're much more vulnerable without that hard shell. So they're letting their new shell harden, and when that happens, they're usually dormant as well. And I think a lot of times that can happen in phases because you get the hatch of crayfish, and as they grow, they're relatively shedding their shells at roughly the same time. So you can have periods where you get a lot of the crayfish in your lake go dormant again, and they'll go dormant for several days, and when that happens, I think the crayfish bite can turn off because a lot of them aren't available again. So it's something you want to pay attention to, is that they're constantly shedding their exoskeletons as they grow. When it comes to fishing, it's not necessarily just about fishing rock. Crayfish absolutely love rock. We know that. The reason they like it is they can get up under the rock and it creates very good homes for them. But what a lot of people don't realize is crayfish eat weeds and grass. They eat decaying wood matter. So if you've got standing timber, a lot of times those crayfish will literally walk up and down the pole timber. And that's one reason why you definitely, when fishing pole timber, if you're trying to mimic crayfish, you want to make sure your bait falls right alongside the pole timber. So when you do get into this 50-degree range, a couple of things that, in my opinion, you want to look for, definitely rock banks because they're coming out of that. If you've got pole timber, it can become very good because the crayfish were hibernating or dormant inside the pole timber and holes inside the pole timber, and they're coming out to start eating on the wood itself. And a lot of times your grass beds, if you've got good green grass, one of the reasons that's good as well is because crayfish are going to that green grass to feed because they eat that. So that's a reason why I think a lot of people, we already know that those areas are good during the spring months and pre-spawn period, but that's one of the main reasons why. So when it comes to trying to mimic crayfish, the way crayfish move, they're very erratic, a lot of quick scoots, a lot of bursts where they're just kind of flaring their tail and shooting a foot or 3 feet at a time. And that's one reason why you start seeing, a lot of people like to go with the old school wiggle warts. The old school wiggle wart is a really good bait that's very erratic. And that's one of the reasons why we switch over to more of a wide wobbling crankbait in the spring. Early on, when you're still got that really cold water, you hear people talking about flat-sided balsa crankbaits that are much more tight wobbling. Well, that's because you're trying to mimic shad at that point. And shad aren't swimming real wide. They're moving with a quick kick of the tail. When the water gets into that 50-degree range, you hear people talking about switching over to wide wobbling crankbaits. Well, that's because now you're mimicking crayfish, which are not swimming like this. They're just shooting all over the place. And when that happens, that's where your wide wobbling erratic crankbaits, like an old school wiggle wart, come into play. The Berkeley Digger is one of my favorite. You get real wide wobble out of that. You got your Rapala DT6s and DT10s is another really good one. And my last really, crankbait that I really like is the Duo Realis. This is the 5A size. I think it's the M62. This is a really good wide wobbling crankbait. Again, it's not necessarily all about reds. You can have natural colors, similar to this natural craw color that's on the wiggle wart. But it is about having a wide wobbling crankbait. And that's because you're mimicking crayfish and not your bait fish. The next bait, the only other really bait that I really like to mimic crayfish is some sort of a jig style bait. It could also fall into that spider grub category, but I love a jig. I love a jig that's got a craw trailer on the back. This is the Berkeley Power Champ, which is one of my favorites because it's super, super natural looking. But really what the jig does is the jig becomes a great crawfish imitator. But one of the keys to fishing this and having success on it is you don't necessarily just want to drag it slow. You want to fish it with a couple of quick hops. You've got your rod tip and you're just popping it. You're not stroking it. You're not moving it 3 feet. You're jumping it 6 inches to a foot at each time, but you're creating that quick pop, which makes it look like the crawfish is, trying to get away from the bass. Those are, really key baits. You can throw the crankbaits down any sort of rock transition bank, rock bank, bluff bank, anything that's got your rock on it, but it can also be your pea gravel banks. Because on pea gravel banks, a lot of times you have crayfish that are out and about because you've got sunken timber on those pea gravel points. The jig, again, works great in those same areas, but I also really like to flip this down standing timber. And as well as any laydowns that I have in that type of matter. But those are really good ways to generate bites. When you're in the low 50-degree range, like a lot of our country is right now, up into the, I would say 50 degrees to like low 60s is your prime time for this, because that's when the majority of the crayfish are coming out of hibernation or dormancy. They're active, they're starting to move around, and the bass are switching over to feeding on them again. And when that happens on your lake, it can be an excellent bite for a couple of weeks because the fish just switch over to it. And that's like what they key in on. And because they're keyed in on crayfish, that's what you want to be doing. You'll get a lot more bites. So guys, I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned a few things. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned. We got another video coming out tomorrow.